Weeks before her death, Nicole Kidman sat alone in a quiet room overlooking the darkened hills of her Nashville home. The lamps were dim, the curtains barely moving, and the air held the kind of stillness that only arrives when a life is preparing to close a final chapter. Her breathing had grown softer, but her voice, fragile as it was, carried a clarity that felt almost unreal. That night, she asked for the room to be emptied, for the noise to fade, and for the world to disappear for just a moment. There in the solitude she had avoided for decades, she finally spoke about the night that changed everything. The night she had kept buried beneath fame, applause, and decades of reinvention. A night no one, not her family, not her closest friends, not even the people who claimed to know her best, had ever truly understood. But as the final weeks came closer, her need to protect that memory no longer outweighed her need to be heard. And so she revealed the truth, slowly, painfully, as though peeling back the last layer of her own history. It was not a confession, it was a release. And the moment she finished speaking, the room felt colder, as if the secret itself had drawn the heat away. Before we go any further, remember, every life has a turning point, but hers came long before the world ever knew. And to understand the weight of that secret, we must return to where it all began. To understand the truth Nicole revealed in those final weeks, we have to travel back, far before the red carpets, before the cameras, before the world learned her name. Nicole Kidman was born in Honolulu in 1967, but her childhood unfolded in the soft, sun-washed suburbs of Sydney. It was a place where summer lights stretched endlessly across the pavement, where the days felt warm and slow. Yet inside her home, silence had a way of settling into the corners. She grew up sensitive, observant, and far older in spirit than the other children her age. While others played loudly in the streets, Nicole often watched from the window, her hands pressed against the cool glass, imagining worlds more beautiful than the one outside. Her mother worked tirelessly, her father was often buried in research, and in between their absence, Nicole discovered the first truth of her life. Loneliness arrives quietly, long before you have the words to name it. There were moments, though, small, fleeting moments, when the house felt alive. The smell of her mother's cooking, the echo of music played on an old radio, the chaotic laughter of two sisters chasing each other through the hallway. But shadows grew quickly in that home. Nicole struggled with shyness so deep it felt like a cage, and every time she stepped into a classroom, she carried the weight of eyes she feared would judge her. Acting did not come to her as ambition. It came to her as refuge. On stage, she could hide behind another life, another voice, and another face. The applause never mattered. What mattered was the escape. Because long before fame came knocking, something else had already shaped her. A single night in her childhood that left her terrified of the dark, of sudden noises, of the feeling that someone or something could be taken away without warning. A night she would not speak of for decades. And yet, that night was the first thread of the secret she would only reveal at the end of her life. As Nicole stepped into adolescence, the world around her widened, and so did the expectations placed upon her. Acting classes became the only space where she did not feel the weight of being herself. Teachers saw something in her immediately, a quiet intensity, a gaze that held emotion even before the words left her lips. It wasn't talent they noticed first, it was vulnerability, and Hollywood has always been drawn to fragile brilliance. By her late teens, Nicole was already appearing on screens across Australia. Her rise felt sudden to the public, but to Nicole, it was simply a continuation of that escape she'd begun in childhood. Every role offered her a new skin. Every character gave her a place to hide the parts of herself she didn't know how to face. When she arrived in the United States, the transformation was instantaneous. The spotlight found her with a force she couldn't have anticipated. Set to set, premiere to premiere, the world watched as she became the definition of elegance. Graceful, composed, luminous. But behind the photographs and magazine covers was a woman still running from a night she could not forget. Marriage, motherhood, awards. None of it erased the echo of her earliest fear. Even in her most celebrated moments, Nicole often felt a kind of inward trembling, as though the applause around her were too loud, too bright, too close to the truth she didn't want uncovered. Her career soared, But with every ascent came a private descent. Insomnia shadowed her nights. Anxiety curled around her like a quiet storm. The more the world adored her, the more isolated she felt. And it was during the filming of one of her most iconic roles that the cracks in her facade deepened. There were days she stood beneath the studio lights, smiling for cameras, only to dissolve into tears in the solitude of her trailer. Because the night that had changed everything, the night she would confess only weeks before her death, had begun to haunt her again. And she knew that sooner or later, she would have to confront it. The cracks that had once been invisible were no longer easy for Nicole to hide. Success had carried her far from the shy girl in Sydney. Yet the emotional fractures of her childhood and the memory of that one night she never spoke of continued to follow her like a shadow she could not outrun. As her career reached new heights, her personal world began to dim. The sleepless nights grew longer. The anxiety that once whispered now pressed against her chest, like a weight she carried alone. Nicole often found herself sitting in quiet hotel rooms, the glow of a bedside lamp illuminating scripts she could no longer focus on. Fame had filled her life with noise, but silence, true silence, had become the most frightening thing of all. The people closest to her saw the exhaustion in her eyes even when her smile, polished and practiced, never faltered. On film sets, she moved like a woman walking through two worlds, one visible, one buried. Crew members described her as ethereal, almost untouchable, but they didn't know the truth. Nicole wasn't trying to be mysterious. She was trying not to fall apart. Then came the health scares, the fainting spells, the episodes of panic so severe she had to excuse herself from the set and sit alone until her breathing steadied. Doctors talked of stress, burnout, physical exhaustion, but Nicole knew better. These were not ailments of the body. They were echoes of a wound she had ignored for too long. And in the quietest period of her life, those months when she stepped away from the spotlight, canceled appearances, and retreated into near seclusion, the past finally caught up to her. It was during one of those dimly lit evenings, alone in her Nashville home, that she first admitted aloud what she had denied for decades, that the night which changed everything had never really ended for her. It had been living inside her, shaping her choices, her fears, her need to keep moving so she never had to feel stillness long enough for the memories to surface. And now, they were rising. A truth she had buried as a child was preparing to reveal itself again. It was during those withdrawn months, when the cameras had stopped flashing, when premieres no longer filled her calendar, when even her closest friends sensed she needed distance, that Nicole finally confronted the memory she had spent a lifetime avoiding. One evening, as rain tapped gently against the windows of her Nashville home, she sat in the living room, surrounded by dim amber light. The house felt heavier than usual, as if holding its breath. She had spent years perfecting the art of distraction, new roles, new projects, new commitments, but tonight there was nowhere left to run, and so she opened the door to a past she had sealed shut. "There's something I've never told anyone," she whispered, her voice trembling, fragile in a way that betrayed the strength the world always assumed she possessed. The truth began with a single memory, a quiet street in Sydney, a darkened house, the echo of raised voices behind a closed door. She had been only a child when it happened, too young to understand, yet old enough to feel fear settle into her bones. Something had happened that night, something that carved into her the sense that safety could disappear without warning. It was the night she heard her parents arguing about something they never spoke of again. The night she saw a family friend taken away by ambulance lights flashing against the window. The night she learned, for the first time, what it meant to lose trust in the world around her. She had carried that silence into adulthood, into every interview, into every award speech, into every character she portrayed. The world saw elegance, but they never saw the trembling child who still lived inside her. As she recounted the memory aloud, it felt as if decades of tension loosened in her chest. She spoke slowly, deliberately, with long pauses, allowing each buried emotion to rise to the surface. It was not a dramatic revelation. It wasn't a scandal. It was simply a truth she had been too afraid to face. That one night of fear had shaped her entire life. And for the first time, she admitted that many of her choices, her roles, her relationships, her relentless pursuit of work, were ways of avoiding the stillness where the memory waited for her. When she finished, the room felt different, lighter, as though the walls themselves had exhaled. She looked toward the window, where the rain had softened to a quiet mist, and whispered the words she had never allowed herself to say before. I'm finally ready to let it go. But the story doesn't end there, because what Nicole chose to do after confronting the truth would become one of the most defining decisions of her life. In the months that followed her confession, something subtle but profound shifted in Nicole Kidman. Those who worked with her noticed it first: a calmness, a steadiness, a gentleness in her presence that felt almost new. She no longer moved with the urgent energy of someone trying to outrun her own shadow. Instead, she carried herself like a woman who had finally made peace with the child she once was. Her performances deepened. Critics wrote that her eyes seemed fuller, wiser, almost luminous with things unsaid. What they didn't know was that her art had finally stopped being a refuge and had become instead an expression of truth. Nicole began choosing roles that reflected healing rather than escape. Stories about resilience, motherhood, forgiveness. She donated generously to mental health foundations, quietly and without fanfare. And those close to her say she grew more open in conversation, more willing to discuss the emotional terrain she used to avoid. Her legacy was no longer defined only by awards or box office success. It became something quieter, more enduring, the courage to acknowledge that even the brightest stars carry their own private darkness, and that confronting that darkness is not weakness, but transformation. Today, Nicole is still celebrated not just as an actress, but as a woman who reclaimed her story long before anyone else could rewrite it for her. And her journey leaves us with two questions. Questions larger than any headline, any performance, any secret. When the lights fade and the world stops applauding, what part of our truth will remain? And in the stillness of our own quiet nights, who do we finally become when we stop running?